Well, good evening, everyone. I think people are being mic'd, and I am respectful of the hour. In case you missed it, it's 10:30 at night, and I don't know why any of you is here. I think this is insane. And for the record, I told that to Wolfgang Ischinger. I said, the members of Congress who have taken red eyes last night, I think Sheila is one and Chris is two, are all going to be asleep. To which he responded, they're members of Congress and they've flown all the way here, they need to work. So we have 3 workers with one, where is Alyssa? On the way, I thought she was here. Okay, well, we have 3 + 1 members of Congress already here. And the goal of this conversation is about Congress. It's not about the Trump administration. It's not about the Obama administration. It's not about the Bush 43 administration. It's about Congress. And the reason I would like to do it that way is, here we have members of the Article 1 branch of government. They were elected as members of Congress. They have serious obligations, including, when appropriate, to declare war, to provide for the common defense, and a variety of other things under our Constitution. And it is, to me, much more enlightening to hear from them about their responsibilities rather than what somebody else is or isn't doing. A bit more preamble, I'm Jane Harmon. I, for 11 years, was a member of Codell McCain. It was a great opportunity. John McCain, and I had a chance to tell him this face-to-face 2 years ago when he was last here, taught generations of members about defense and security policy. He was a master. Doesn't mean he was always fun to be around, but he was a master, and when he was here, he occupied the field, and the delegation was tightly organized around him. And he spent a lot of time in the sessions. He spoke at the sessions, and it was a fabulous education. So I spent 11 years on Codell McCain, and in the last 8 years since leaving Congress on my own feet, not because of an election, to do something by my lights more productive at the moment, which is to head a marvelous think tank called the Wilson Center, a nonpartisan policy tank in Washington. For those 8 years, I've still been here. Wolfgang, you're here, hello. One of the pleasures of coming back here is that I serve on Wolfgang's executive committee. And if anyone missed this, Wolfgang Ischinger was a phenomenally good German ambassador to the US, which is when we met in the years right after 9/11. Okay, so let's introduce our panel. I think people know who they are. Alyssa, there you are.
Yes, I'm sorry. I will never go to the restroom again. Panel. So sorry. I like a woman who starts things on time.
As Sheila knows, there's a great story about that. One restroom on the 2nd floor of the Capitol, which is where the floor of the House is. One.
There's now 2.
There's now 2?
Yes.
Since I left?
Yes.
Oh. And while I was there, the picture of every woman who had served in the House fit on the wall of the little anteroom to the restroom, which was the office of John Adams, I think, when he came back. Yes. But at any rate, right? Yes. And so there had been 300 women serving in the House over the years and 10,000 men. That's how it was. And now it's more. Good news, probably closer to 500 women and 10,000 men. At any rate, this is not a session about that, but just listen up. More than 100 women in the House is great news, and 20% women in the Senate is great news. This panel, as I said, is about Congress. Wolfgang, you missed this part. It's not about what you think of the Trump administration. But we will, I think, mix it up. We have a brand new member. Alyssa's our brand new member. She has serious experience as a CIA analyst, as an acting assistant secretary of defense, and I think you were also at on the NSC staff?
I was, yeah, for both on Bush and Obama. Yeah.
So, only that. But is this the first elected office?
Yes.
You sought? and you
First
hold?
time I've ever run for election, first time I've ever done any of that.
Well, congratulations. We're all thrilled for you. And she's from what state? What might that state be?
Michigan, if anyone from
All right.
Michigan in the house, okay. A thumbs up, I'll take a thumbs up.
Sheila Jackson Lee was elected in 1994.
Yes, that's correct.
2 years after I was. She is a fixture in the House. You can't miss her. She is on 3 committees. That's unusual,
Yes.
really, for the House. But she has several positions on the House Intelligence Committee, and she reminds me, at the House Homeland Security Committee, she reminds me that we were there together.
That's right.
Back in the day. Homeland Security, Budget, and
Judiciary.
Judiciary.
And the crime subcommittee covers terrorism and homeland security investigations.
There we go. Mike Turner is a prince. He's a lovely man. He has served for a long time on the House Armed Services Committee. And what other committees are you on?
Serve on intelligence.
Intelligence. And strategic forces and other issues like that have been a focus of his for years. And I remember that when Ellen Tauscher, who many of you know, was there, and I think she chaired the committee and you were ranking?
Correct.
You were a happy bipartisan duo.
Absolutely.
And there are rare outbreaks of bipartisanship in the House. Chris Coons is a marvel. He's the hardest worker on the planet. He told me he's on 5 subcommittees of the Appropriations Committee. 5. He's only not on Defense and one other.
VA Milcom.
And he's on 4 other committees.
I'm on Judiciary, Foreign Relations, Appropriations, Small Business, and I'm Vice Chairman of Ethics
So far.
so far.
Yeah. I mean, go figure.
It's fun.
He has no other life. No, he actually has a family.
3 wonderful children
3 wonderful children who see him on alternate.
on television.
All right, we're not going there.
It's a big
So
joke.
I set this up by saying that this is a panel about Congress. And you know, my theory of the game, not starting with the Trump administration, is that over the last 3, and maybe more, we've had an executive with expanding power and a Congress with shrinking power.
Yes.
And it's been deliberate on both sides. Deliberate on the executive branch side because presidents, I think the 3 we've had, have not as seriously as they should have engaged with Congress. They've also found that signing statements and other kinds of executive orders are an easy way to make things happen or some things happen. And on Congress's side, as partisanship has increased to the level of dysfunction, again, my theory is not that the people don't have talent, but the business model has become blame the other side for not solving the problem, because if you work with the other side, you are bipartisan, which makes you target practice in a primary. So people don't do it. And the centrifugal forces are hugely powerful. And the end is an organization that does very little. So let's start with that. That's Jane's theory of the case. Who is the longest serving member here? Sheila. Sheila, 94? What do you think of Jane's theory of the case?
As much as I like Jane, and she is a very special person, I'm delighted to be here with you. And Wolfgang, I fear to call you that. I will say Mr. Ambassador. I'm delighted to be here at the conference. On my way to another conference that I think you admire, the Helsinki Commission, and working on peace and security. I take great issue and would make the argument that we are challenged in this climate. But for those of you not familiar with the U.S. Constitution, there was a reason for the Founding Fathers creating Article 1 as the United States Congress, the congressional body that represents the people. So we have the authority. Second, of course, is the executive, and third is the judiciary. They are listed as co-equal branches of government, but in many instances, sometimes that is not the case. And as I've watched the Congress, it has gotten younger, it's gotten more diverse. More stories, human stories, come to the United States Congress, and I think my colleagues would say that is positive. Having a years-long expert in national security issues and intelligence and you have developed your expertise both in intelligence but also in military issues, foreign affairs, and I'd like to think national security, immigration issues, and of course, issues dealing with criminal justice. So the way I would frame this is that we must use the power effectively for the American people. And I just want to give 2 examples. Yes, I've been here the longest, and I've been through the ups and downs. I've been through an impeachment. I've been through wars. I was here for the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, some were here as well. But what I would make the point on, particularly Section 5 as it relates to NATO.
Article
Now that's
5.
most recent.
Yeah.
That's most recent, where Congress made a different statement. Of course, I'm not speaking about who made one statement, but we, as a Congress, said that Article 5, that it is an important element for not only the Congress, but the people of the United States. We just have to use power constructively to make a difference. So I would just
Okay.
say we have the power, we need to use it.
Thank you. All right, well, let's go to the other chamber for a minute. Chris, your view of the case, and we're going to go through specific examples of what Congress did or didn't do, next, but
There's
just observing this.
There's a variety of reasons why Congress has gradually weakened relative to the executive. One thing I'll add to your theory of the case, Jane, is that the committees have become less and less powerful as leadership has become more powerful. What does that mean? Historically, over the last 20 or 30 years, someone like a Senator John McCain, who was chairman of Armed Services, could defy his caucus leadership because the independent power of committees to pass legislation, to set an agenda for hearings, to deny confirmation to critical nominees of the president, that power has gradually diminished as majority leaders have acted to override their committee chairs and to take bills straight to the floor over the heads of their committee chairs, or to deny them the opportunity to consider certain issues. We have seen, at least in the last 2 years, some moments where on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, even though it's the same party as the president, we've taken an action that the president publicly said he was opposed to. I'll give one example. Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or so-called CATSA, something that passed 98-2.
To explain, this was forcing the
sanctions on
issuance
Russia,
of sanctions
essentially.
against 3 countries, contrary to the president's wishes.
Correct. So to agree with the Congresswoman, we've got under our Constitution an enormous amount of power, both in terms of appropriations and nominations and confirmations, and in an agenda setting. But we have to be willing to use it. We have to be willing to issue subpoenas. We have to be willing to block appropriations. We have to be willing to move legislation. And in an environment where control of the Senate has changed hands more times in the last 20 years than the previous 50, because each 2 years there is a real chance that control of the Senate will change, and that control is critical to our Supreme Court, to the confirmation of the cabinet, and to the passage of legislation. We've had majority and minority leaders who are more focused on winning back the control of the Senate than on actually standing up to the other branch.
Well, so then the shorthand for that is Congress is more of or the Senate, let's say, is more of a re-election machine than it is a policy factory.
In recent years, that's become steadily more important.
Okay, Mike, what do you think?
Well, I want to do 2 things first. One, I want to recognize Madeleine Albright and thank her for her service and the tenor
That's a good
that she
idea.
served
Let's
in.
always do that.
And of course, Wolfgang, thank you for your leadership in what is an incredible dialogue opportunity, the bilaterals, everything. This is, I always say that the president in the United States has the State of the Union. This is sort of the state of international security. This is where everybody comes to learn what is our agenda for the next year and to make their policy statements. And then I want to thank Jane, because I know you actually are all here just to listen to Jane. Thank you for your leadership. You really were a bipartisan beacon in the House. We got to work together, but you have remained an intellectual powerhouse in international security. So thank you for doing that, because you could be doing anything. Thank you for doing this. So I'm going to agree and disagree a bit with what you've said, and I think the disagreement part will sort of be good news. The agreement part will be what we all suspect and sort of know. Yes, just as the senator said, I think committees have lost their powers, and it has been given over really to a leadership structure that is geared toward winning elections. And so that punishes those who wish to work together on a bipartisan basis. I've seen it in the Armed Services Committee where our chairs did act more independently both, because I've been, now this is the second time I will be with a Democrat who has the gavel, and of course I've served twice in Republican control of the House. But the chairs don't have the type of authority that they had before to really engage the full committee in policy discussions. But we also all see the bad effects of that election cycle being now every day instead of every 2 years or every 6 years in what we watch on Fox News, CNBC, and the rest, because it's always the talking heads that are churning. But, and I know the senator would agree with this, is that there is still a lot of work that gets done and that's bipartisan. We work together on the Armed Services bill, for example. Requires a bipartisan agreement for the bill to move forward. And it's moved forward every year. It has a structure where, in addition to our committees having professional staff, in addition to partisan staff, the bill doesn't move forward until it goes through what we call the Big Four. And then that is that the ranking member and the chair of each of the two houses, so on a bipartisan basis, 3 out of 4 have to agree on a provision for that bill to move forward. That isn't true of every committee. Some committees, you got 2 and it's moving. So I just want to say there is a lot of work that gets done on a bipartisan basis, but you're right, the tone and tenor certainly has changed.
Okay, Alyssa, the newbie, you've been there for 14 minutes, or 15 minutes maybe,
Right.
almost. Any observations on all this?
I mean, I think even before I got in, certainly the topic you're talking about of sort of the weakening of some of the use of those authorities, for me, played out very, very clearly in the authorization of military force.
It's exactly where I'm going.
Yeah, and being at the Pentagon, you know, I'm a CIA officer, and then at the Pentagon, my husband is a 30-year Army colonel, my stepdaughter's in the service. So the issue of authorizing military force is very personal, as well as being something I worked on professionally. And it just feels like, basically, since the decision to go into Iraq, when people had to really put on the line their vote, there's been this mutual decision silently made between executive branch and legislative branch that we're not going to touch this. And we see it play out now, right? We're using a 2002 document for our wars all over the world.
2001. We're using the authorization.
It was updated in 2002, yes.
In Afghanistan, not the one in Iraq.
Yeah,
And
well,
we've used it 37 times. I have the facts here. To send U.S. forces to 14 countries, including Yemen.
yeah, so that's something, you know, that's, again, if you look at sort of the Constitution, there are some very clear ways that Congress has a check and balance. And we just, I think, I personally am interested in seeing Congress exercise that authority in new and better ways.
Well, let me push you for a second, because you have thought about it, and you have deep executive branch experience. Does anyone else here have that? No. Okay. So we basically, in recent years, have passed 2, one on Afghanistan and one on Iraq. Most people think the Iraq AUMF is not applicable to anything else. But the Afghanistan AUMF, as I said, has been used 37 times in 14 countries. You said there's kind of a tacit deal between the executive branch and the Congress not to enact another one. I would make possibly a different argument, just want to see what you think about it. Some members of Congress truly want a new AUMF, one or more, to authorize or not to authorize some of our actions. Our assistance, military assistance in the war in Yemen is enormously unpopular, and I'm sure everyone can talk about that. But one of the issues is, should Congress circumscribe carefully the powers of the executive, including boots on the ground or not, or should Congress give the president much more room to act as commander-in-chief? And I think there's a real split in Congress about that, so guess what happens? Nothing. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I've witnessed it from the executive branch, watching different iterations. The White House tried to come up with their version. We've had many members who have tried valiantly to pass this. And I acknowledge that there's debate. I guess my feeling is we owe it to the forces who are fighting these wars to actually power through that debate and get something done. And that's difficult. I acknowledge it's difficult, and I acknowledge that I'm the new one in the room, so everyone's probably like, wait till you get into it. I think if...
They wouldn't say that. No.
They might.
These are polite members. Oh.
But if we are sending them into war, then Congress can negotiate a new AUMF.
Other views? Anybody disagree with that?
I spent a great deal of time in the last two Congresses, Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Menendez, and at different times, Ranking Member Cardin, engaged really vigorously. We had hearings, we had conversations, we had debates, and the challenge was that the middle wasn't big enough.
Right.
There's one end that was determined that the president have no constraints in terms of geography, time, scope, and another end that didn't want to authorize the president to do anything. And to get a majority in the center that said, we are conducting wars, let's authorize this, 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 and then come up with a process for anything new beyond that, it was like tissue paper to ever get enough that we could actually get it out of committee, and if it got out of committee, get it through the floor. I welcome your new energy. I agree with you that we owe it to the men and women who serve us for it to be clear, because no one in 2001 could have imagined that we'd still be using that authorization in this many conflicts around the world, and it is Congress failing to do its constitution.
And just one PS to that. The other thing that comes with an authorization to use military force is a debate about the authorization to use military force, which gets the public into the conversation.
Engaged and informed.
And many people who are suffering war fatigue, who isn't suffering war fatigue, say, we never were consulted, we never understood what this was about. And that would help our country buy into something, or not, that does involve the loss of life and the loss of treasure.
A majority of the currently serving Senate did not vote for that AUMF.
Mike.
I was just going to make that point. And Senator, I think you really captured it. It's not necessarily political danger. It's a danger of what the final product would be. And in that, there's not consensus in Congress. But to underscore your point, I've been in Congress 17 years now. I'm 88th in seniority. I have never voted on any of the authorizations of use of military force that we're currently operating under. So that tells you how far we've gotten. I was talking to Joe Wilson. He's like 74 in seniority. He had not voted on any of them either. So you have to get pretty deep into Congress to even find anyone who voted on the ones that we're currently operating on. So Congress has not had the debate.
So Sheila, that makes you a dinosaur.
Yeah,
Just thought you should know.
hopefully a young one. But let me let me say that I'm moving a little bit toward you, Jane, in terms of where our Achilles heel is. But let me copy my good friend who acknowledged Secretary Albright. I just want to remind her we were in Bangladesh together, and I didn't see you, but thank you so very much for all you do, and as well acknowledge Jane. She is stupendous on your commentary on these important issues. There is a core group of progressives, and I guess Senator Coons would put those in the left, that have been pushing over the years to debate this question on the floor. And you're absolutely right. We owe you not just a debt of gratitude and thank you for your service, but we owe you to get on the ground and really peel through what an AUMF would mean. And I think the problem is, I'm going to say with great leadership, but leadership puts legislation on the floor. I'd like to almost take a chance and put an initiative on the floor, but give it the decency of debate time that really allows us to maybe ultimately get the groups on this side and the groups on this side to find the middle and to really see whether or not something can come. Because out of debate, you might have a resolution. The problem, of course, is that you're in the House, you're putting a specific provision on the floor, and you don't amend necessarily on the floor. You come with amendments to the floor. But I don't know whether it would be helpful, and our rules are skewed, that we have a general debate on this question, because everyone grumbles about it, that we don't have a vigorous debate for the world to even see about our direction in terms of
Well,
use of
let me
military
just add
force.
one more wrinkle, and then I want to turn to 2 or 3 other issues and take questions from the floor and go to bed at 11:30. How's that? Wolfgang is staying up all night. You know, this is how he rolls, but the rest of us sleep a little bit. I heard the Vice President this morning. We're not commenting on him or his policy, but he did mention that the administration supports what he called the interim president of Venezuela. Now, it's not clear what will happen in Venezuela. Maybe there will be no transition of power, a peaceful transition of power, or maybe there will be a full-blown civil war, and or maybe there will be the insertion of some form of U.S. force. Maybe. I'm not saying there will be. I just said it is possible. Similarly, I want to talk about Iran in connection with the JCPOA. But in Iran, Europe has been urged to pull out of the JCPOA. More pressure is being put on Iran. There is conversation about possible military options against Iran. I'm certainly not endorsing the idea. But should the U.S., the executive branch of the U.S., be contemplating actions in either theater, should Congress get into this act ahead of time and decide whether it would authorize force in either context?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Sure, and I would just say we're sort of, part of this issue is upon us. Because when we hear, Mr. Bolton talking about using a base in Syria, Al-Tanf, to go after the Iranians, that is not in any version of the AUMF that we have. It's not that I don't want to go after Iranians. I'm a Shia militia expert by training, but that is not authorized. So that the 2 issues you're talking about are upon us.
Okay. Well, we could talk about a lot of other things. Let's shift gears and talk about an executive order which happened to be issued on Friday. Is this Friday? Yesterday. Today. And recently. It's very late at night. I don't know what day it is, but
It was an emergency declaration.
an emergency order that was just issued by the President of the United States, and that is clearly very controversial. I thought I'd just put the topic out there. We're not talking about the border wall, but we're talking about the idea of the President of the United States issuing an emergency order ahead of signing a continuing resolution, which is a stopgap spending bill. At least it lasts through this fiscal year, September 30. Please, I'm welcoming any comments you have about this, the issuance of an emergency order. Is it a proper use, do you think, of executive authority?
No.
No. Okay, you want to explain anything, Mike?
Well, let me say this. It is not a national emergency just because Nancy Pelosi says no. So we have to make that clear. Just because the president is getting out of Congress what the president wants does not make it a national emergency. So what that means is the administration has to make the case that it's a national emergency. Now, they're part of the problem in this debate in Congress over the border is that we have right now a border that is open, and there are people on a continuous basis that are crossing it. The Armed Services Committee just had a hearing on this. There are portions of our border where people cross unimpeded. And so that is an issue that needs to be addressed. The president's going to have to make the case as to why that's a national emergency. But the second aspect of what he's going to have to make the case is, which is the one that troubles me the most, is if this is declared a national emergency, where are the funds coming from? Because if the president declares a national emergency and then begins to take funds that have been validly appropriated for other security issues and applies them to this without the debate of Congress, without the approval of Congress, then Congress's authority has been usurped.
Well, isn't that the plan, the second
That's
part?
the plan. We've not seen the implementation. We have not seen what they're going forward with, but that certainly is what
Well,
is
there's
currently being
an
stated.
$8 billion figure out there subtract the 1.3 billion, and then there's a list of places where the funds would be moved.
Where they have currently proposed. What they're going to do next, we're going to have to see. But there is, I think, grave concern of validly appropriated and authorized funds that have been put in place for what truly is national security being taken and usurped congressional authority in that.
So if I might follow my friend, I am from a border state, Texas, Tejas, and spent a lot of time at the border and spent a lot of time with my colleagues who live on the border. They are outraged of the misinterpretation or characterization of their home as a place that there needs to be declared an emergency. And might I just say, in comparison, having studied and watched the migration in Europe when there was this complete horror and various countries acting, some in good ways and some in bad ways. And we watched, heart poured out to those migrating, but also understood the responsibilities of governments to deal with. But the migration was huge. The numbers were huge coming into Europe. The loss of life at sea was huge. I was here in Europe when those large numbers were coming. That is not what is going on at the southern border. At the southern border, there is regular order. There are what we call ports of legal entry. So there are actually places where people can come in. There are places where you cannot. Since I came to Congress, we have put hundreds of miles of barrier, some steel fencing, starting from San Diego, going to as far as Texas. It's not sea to shining sea. So the point is that there is no basis to declare an emergency when there is massive trade and travel and families going back and forth. You know, emergency is thousands upon thousands bombarding a place that does not exist.
But in fairness, Congress passed the law that spells out, well, it doesn't spell out, that's the point. No, not the secure fencing law. There's an emergency act that Congress, I can't remember what the name of it is, passed in the late 70s, and it doesn't define what emergency is. And presidents have used this law, invoked this law, as President Trump said, dozens of times. It has never been invoked as it is potentially being invoked now to justify reprogramming money that has been authorized and appropriated by Congress. And that's the part I wanted to focus on. It's not that we don't have strong feelings about the border, but it's really Congress's authorities being usurped.
Well, he's usurping it for there not being an emergency. I'll just finish on this sentence. What it means is that he will, the point you're making is that he will go to the budget and that it will be only his decision, or the administration, let me just not make it his, only the administration's determination of what money. And it might be disaster money, meaning money that is there for natural disasters, which would hurt many across the country.
Yeah, and it might be military construction money, which also helps shore up military bases and other facilities that are used to keep us safe. Alyssa, you worked on the other side of this thing. Do you have
I mean, I just think as a strict appropriation issue, I agree that it just doesn't make sense to rob Peter to pay Paul. I think the whole debate around the border is like focusing on the symptom when the real problem is our broken immigration system. It's working for zero, for no one. And until we deal with that, we're going to keep having this fight, one border at a time, one category of people at a time, constantly, until we get at the root of the problem.
Well, I would just point out that the subject of comprehensive immigration reform has been debated by Congress for decades, and it has, you know, no progress has been made, which again is a sign to me of the sad dysfunction of the institution, not all the people in it. Let me ask one other question, because I think everybody here has questions, and that is what I would call weaponizing government shutdowns. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. It's a wonderful place. We have a wing of the Reagan building downtown, and our workforce is 1/3 federal. So what happened for a 35-day period was 1/3 of the workforce was by law prohibited from coming to work except for a few who were accepted and then got to come to work and work for free. And certainly, as sad as I was for them, and there were true personal hardships, when you think about the TSA people and the others who were part of our security infrastructure being accepted and coming to work for free, it's outrageous. So we have perfected this art of weaponizing shutdowns, and I wonder if anyone here has a suggestion. Alyssa, good.
Yeah.
For how to stop this.
The new freshman class came and inherited this shutdown, right? We were sworn in on January 3rd, and all we knew for the first 5 weeks was a shutdown. And as a federal government employee for 14 years, I helped run the shutdown in 2013, the results of sequestration where we furloughed people. So I feel
Explain what sequestration is. I don't think everyone knows.
Just sort of some automatic cuts that were forced upon the Defense Department, which were never, I think, intended to be actually used. It was meant to be a huge threat, like we would never do this, and then we did it, and we had to make immediate budget cuts just gratuitously in an emergency fashion. So I'm going home every weekend, as is everyone, and I'm going through TSA, and I'm hearing from the FAA employees, the air traffic controllers, from everyone, and everyone's asking, like, why as a country do we do this, right? Does anyone know another country in the world that shuts down its own government when two parties or two branches can't agree? I haven't found one, right? And the other question they asked me was, why is it that I'm penalized when you all can't agree? Very good question. So a bunch of freshmen got together and we announced a bill called the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns Act. And it is a bill that basically says if you can't come to an appropriation agreement after 30 days, right, you go into a CR for 30 days, and then after 30 days, everyone in Congress, everyone in the executive office of the president, all his political appointees have their salaries suspended. No one is allowed to travel on the government dime out of Washington. There are daily quorum meetings, no gyms. Try
Raise your
taking away
hand if
people's
you
gyms.
like this plan.
No gyms, no golf courses. And
I think you can pass it here.
yeah, well, so as a new member, there was some pressure to not put forward this idea, right? And I had a lot of people say, like, hey, you know, I'm not a billionaire, I need my money too. And it's like, so does the TSA agent who makes $38,000 a year. Yeah. So I think we should end shutdowns as a concept of a weapon between two branches of government.
Okay, my last question.
Oh, sure.
Good, pretty good.
Take some applause.
Your first.
I see some federal employees out there, that's why.
It's your
Formers.
Yeah.
Formers.
Would staff not be paid too, or just members?
No, it's the senior-most folks, right? We don't want to penalize the junior staffer.
I see.
That
There
person's
you
not
go.
responsible.
My last question. In your dreams, folks, this is in terms of making Congress work better or getting one thing that you really care about in the national security area enacted into law in the next 2 years, which is the House cycle. I know we have one person here who enjoys a longer term. In your dreams, what would that one thing be? We'll start with Chris.
This is just off the top of my head. I have a bill with Cory Gardner that would create the first new committee of the Senate since 1974. We are failing to deal with cybersecurity because it is spread across the jurisdiction of Intel, Armed Services, Commerce, Judiciary. I mean, it's literally almost every committee. It would be a new cybersecurity committee where the chair and ranking of each of those 7 committees serves or their designee to try and have a full spectrum look at cyber and its impact on our economy, our security, our democracy, and come up with a coherent, cohesive plan as a result of that.
So would it have jurisdiction, or would it just be a collection of folks who,
it would have jurisdiction to address
elsewhere?
Anything that touches on cybersecurity from wherever it comes from.
And other committees couldn't claim, we've seen
Correct.
this in the Homeland area,
Right.
that it didn't.
You'd have to refer, so if you're Homeland Security, if
So
you're
this is a
intelligence,
real
if you're
committee
armed-
with
it'd be a
real power.
committee with staff and
Whoa.
power. Yeah, which is why it'll never happen, I know.
Which is why I don't know. Did you hear that last comment? That was.
But you said if I could wave a magic wand.
Okay. All right, Mike, what would you do?
To play off what Alyssa was saying, I mean, the number 2 problem that we have specifically in the area of national security besides shutdowns is continuing resolutions.
Yes. And
we end up always freezing our military. We waste unbelievable amounts of dollars because, as people are fond to say, whenever we have a continuing resolution, it's Congress hasn't got its work done. To explain this, our fiscal year ends October 1st. And if we don't have our bills done by October 1st, the military gets frozen until it's over. What we need to do, because the calendar year is actually statutory, we just need to move the calendar year to the fiscal year to the calendar year. Congress works on a calendar year. If we get our job done late, it's maybe by a couple weeks, but right now we're getting it done months, and that has even more damage overall than even the shutdowns do.
Is that a very controversial idea?
What it is that people just aren't really familiar with the effects of continuing resolutions to the extent they should be. Even Paul Ryan said until he got to be Speaker, he had no idea what the effects were when he served as budget chairman. So it's an education, and second off, it's empowering them, letting them know, hey, we can just fix this, we can move it.
Sheila?
Well, first, I want Alyssa to know that the somewhat senior people are right there with you. Do not
That's right.
weaponize. I say do not hold our federal employees hostage. So
I apologize for calling you a dinosaur. I call myself that all the time.
I smiled. I said young.
Oh, okay.
But I'm following at least one point that has been made, and that is on the cybersecurity end. I've introduced legislation entitled dealing with zero-day events. And so it is to ask for, and I'm on the Cybersecurity Committee of Homeland Security. I think what Chris is saying is that there's a number of jurisdictions, I guess in the Senate and in the House. But I believe the Cybersecurity Committee on Homeland Security can be the sort of the holding place for really getting into the teeth, getting into the meat of cybersecurity in the government. So the question I want to have answered and to have detailed is how we would meet a zero-day when everything seemed to converge on collapse, to get in front of it. And I don't think government or the private sector has thoroughly investigated how to meet that potential crisis. And we keep talking about it, but we haven't given a matrix or best practices to be able to relate to it. And then the second point, Jane, is that Congress can investigate without intensity and extra partisanship. So the Judiciary Committee is now investigating a number of issues, from the elections to various issues dealing with the Constitution and dealing with the actions of the executive branch. It is really our duty to do so, and it's the duty of Congress to do so. If we could just investigate facts, subpoenas, hearings, so the American people can see that it is doing your job and that you're not, in essence, trying to excoriate or to make points, but you're doing the work that you're supposed to do. And I'd like to be able to carry that forward in a way that the American people understand, and the world, I assume, looks and says, this is the way to make sure that government works. Investigations are to make sure that government works.
Alyssa?
So it may sound strange at a foreign policy event, but because we all, I think most people want the United States to be an active, have an active role in the world. But our role in the world is directly proportional to our economy and how the state of mind is back home. And if we do not figure out how to drop the price of healthcare, prescription drugs, and fix our infrastructure, the ability, at least in my district, to actually focus on any of the issues that happen in this room is about this big.
So what would you like to get done?
I would like to
in
lower
your
the cost
first
of
2
prescription
years?
drugs, allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, and I can give
Isn't
you a
that
whole
wonderful?
damn list. But it is if we do not, as much as I want to engage on all this stuff, if I do not fix those issues, I do not deserve to be back in my seat.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to leave on such a dramatic note, but that's
Well, it
how
was
I feel.
inspiring. I mean, it's huge ambition. We love it. All right, questions. Is there a microphone? The first one is the fourth row back there, and the second one is right here. Identify yourself and ask one question so we can get around in the next 14 minutes.
I'll try. Thank you. Simon Schuster, Time Magazine. I've seen the Codells here this year playing an unusual role, taking the lead in reassuring European allies about the U.S. commitment to their defense. What's that been like for you this year? What kind of responses have you gotten? And do you think that congressional reassurances are enough to put their nervousness at ease? Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't think everybody has to answer every question. Why don't we start with one answer, and if it's not enough, we'll have a second answer.
Well, this is the largest congressional delegation ever to this conference. And it's not as if there was some huge organized campaign. There were many senators and House members who, given the current context, felt called to invest the time and energy to be here. And you'll have to tell us whether our presence has been reassuring. It was our intention by participating in bilateral meetings, in meetings with representatives.
That's terrific.
Your presence is reassuring.
Yeah.
Every
and
single-
half the members have never been to this conference before.
A significant number of us have never been to this conference before, and in many of the meetings I've participated in, you've got folks who are really far apart at home in our domestic politics saying exactly the same thing about our value of the European community, of NATO, of the transatlantic relationship, and our determination to stay with you going forward in our security commitments and in the values commitments that hold us together. In case, I don't want us to end without emphasizing this.
We're not ending yet.
Secretary Albright and the Atlantic Council and Stephen Hadley and a whole range of folks launched a set of principles today, a statement that emphasizes our shared values across both the North Atlantic community and the EU and NATO. I recommend it to you if you somehow missed this. It's a reminder of what it is that calls us together here and a reminder of what it is so many of us have worked so long for.
Second question right here. And then
Thank you. My name is Werner Sonner. I'm a former correspondent in the US for German television. And my take here is that nobody on this panel seems to believe that there is a national emergency in the US right now. And I have a simple question. What will you guys do about it?
I would disagree with you. So I want to be clear. I didn't say there was not a national emergency. I said the president has to make the case of the national emergency. I actually believe, and it doesn't matter if it's a European country or it's the United States, the issue of being able to exercise sovereignty is probably one of the most important issues that you can have as a nation. And right now we have, the reason why we've had stalled immigration policies is the number one item on everyone's debate is secure the border. And from that, then we can get to the reforming of our immigration policy. If you're not going to secure the border, it doesn't matter what our laws say. The border itself will let people self-select, and sovereignty isn't asserted. So to be clear, what I said is I think the congressional role is both, one, assuring that the President of the United States make the case as to the basis he asserts for the national emergency, but secondly, the concern I have is the second part also is to where those funds go from, and that is a congressional usurping of power because those are funds we will have already directed to a place.
And it's also true that this order is being tested in the courts right now, and there's a chance that it will be enjoined and go straight up to our Supreme Court, and there will be action outside of Congress as well as possibly in Congress.
Absolutely, and that's what we're making the case.
But there are other people on this panel. I would like
Right. Does anyone else want to comment?
I just want to brief. Congress is acting. Some of us have filed legislation. Obviously, that's a tough mountain to climb. Privilege resolution dealing with this issue. But members of Congress can file a lawsuit as well. Mm-hmm. And just on the definition, many times the emergency declaration has been on the basis of war or extraordinary disaster or other matters. And in the instance of the border, my final sentence is that there is work on the border dealing with border security from technology to personnel, drones, barriers. There have been a whole level of work done on the border to assist in this issue. I think comprehensive immigration reform is reasonable, but also working with the countries where these people have come from to boost their economy and to work with them. There are many issues other than building the
Right.
concept that we're talking about.
There are lots of questions, so I'm just trying to get to people. In the back. There's you, then he's first.
Good evening. My name is Arne Lietz. I'm a member of the European Parliament. I'm so happy that so many American representatives are here. I'm also a member of the Atlantikbrücke, and so that really matters to me, coming from East Germany like Angela Merkel. I wonder, we have had the first session on the floor on climate and climate diplomacy and climate insecurity. John Kerry said he was missing the word climate and climate change. Even the president from Egypt brought it up. So the question is from me, do you think that climate security, climate diplomacy is a good boundage we can bring together from the European Union? Did you miss also that this was not raised by Mr. Pence today in his speech? Thank you.
Was not raised. Is that what you said? Was not raised by him.
Yeah.
Answer?
I mean, I think climate is an absolutely critical issue. I was at Paris 2 years ago with a delegation. I do think that the United States is at the city level, the municipal level, and the state level, continuing to make efforts to meet our commitments. But I think the withdrawal, the official withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty was a mistake, and its absence from the Vice President's remarks, I regret. I do think there are conservative mechanisms that one could use to try and address climate change. You know, there are current bills that are being debated that would use market mechanisms through a carbon dividend or a carbon price. But frankly, to pretend this isn't happening and it's not affecting our whole world is to cede a piece of American leadership, in my view.
Okay, question here.
We agree. I agree.
Thank you. Alan Mack, member of the UK Parliament. In light of American involvement in Iraq to Afghanistan and Syria, how do you feel that American public opinion has changed over the last couple of years in relation to deploying American troops overseas in the future?
I mean, what I see is a coming together of the left and the right and uniting on getting out of long wars in the Middle East. And I think that, you know,
And Congress's role in doing this?
well, I think that there's a lot of debate, even within, you know, members of Congress about what the right approach is. I mean, you saw the president tweeted out that we were leaving Syria, and there were lots of Democrats who said, good, let's leave Syria. So I think the issue for me highlights a bigger trend, which I saw, frankly, from the campaign world where you're working with a lot of young people. A lot of young people don't remember 9/11. They've only known the United States in what they believe to be long, unending, expensive war in blood and treasure. They don't have a memory, even through their grandparents, of the World War II and the post-World War II order. And they don't believe we do good things in the world. And they believe that China and Russia similarly don't do good things in the world, but there's no fundamental difference. And that scares me to death. To death. And everyone in this room should be concerned about that, about American citizens growing up believing that we don't have a special role in the world. And I think that the view on the wars and the coming together of the right and the left is a manifestation of a much bigger trend.
Yeah, Chris?
I'll disagree just a little bit, if I might, respectfully. First, something I think that has changed in American culture within my lifetime is the attitude towards veterans and those who serve in our active duty military. It is absolutely across the board, uniformly
So much
positive and supportive. I came of age when the older brothers of my classmates were fighting in Vietnam. And we treated our returning veterans just despicably, horribly. We failed to thank them or honor them in any way because there was so much domestic division over that conflict. That has fundamentally changed, first. Second, there is a younger generation that does not have a sense of clarity about why we're in this war, but the generation that's my age that has been serving or knows people who are serving is very weary but willing to continue. And the debate within families and within communities about the possibility of our withdrawal from Syria or Afghanistan tilts strongly depending on whether you know someone who has served and whether you have a sense of why we went in there. I think it is widely varied across the country. I tend more to believe Vice President Biden, who said that the majority of Americans want us to do good in the world, believe we can, but have questions about these two undertakings and their ultimate outcomes.
All right, the last three questions are, Trudy Rubin is first, over there is second, and here is third. And please, let's put them all together, and then the panel will answer all of them.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Congress has passed some, both the Senate and together has passed some interesting bipartisan sense of the legislature amendments, especially one disagreeing with the president on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and Syria. Apart from new legislation to enable wars, authorize wars, what other kinds of action do you believe that Congress can take that would actually have an impact on foreign policy, especially given that all of you who came here have strong feelings about transatlantic relations and NATO?
Okay, question over here.
Christoph von Marschall from the German daily Der Tagesspiegel, and I've been the inaugural Helmut Schmidt Fellow of the German Marshall Fund recently. I have a question concerning NATO. We could read in American newspapers that, that President Trump inquired whether he could pull out of NATO and how the legal situation is. And of course, it's complicated. But the general rule is, yes, the president can pull out. You need in the American Constitution the agreement with Congress to enter international treaties, but not to pull out. So what would be the reaction of Congress if such a thing would happen? President Trump declares, I'm done with NATO, it's a bad bargain for the American taxpayer, and I pull out. And if there are disagreements on the podium, please tell us, because it's an important question for you.
We're going to ask everybody each of these questions. Last question over here. Over here, in front of Trudy Rubin. Yep.
I'm Jack Janes from Washington. I'm just curious, you've just lost a very treasured man from the Congress, John Dingell. Mm-hmm. And you also lost John McCain. Both of them gave speeches, at least in terms of saying, basically, the Congress is broken. McCain said it on the Senate floor.
Yes, he did.
And John Dingell wrote here in December, public service should not be a commodity, and elected officials should not have to rent themselves out to the highest bidder. Did that make an impact on you thinking about what that meant, and maybe for even someone who's only been there for 14 minutes?
Okay, superb questions. The first is, can Congress do more than just pass resolutions of disapproval of actions? The second question is, what could Congress do if the president unilaterally tried to pull out of NATO? And the third one is, yes, can Congress be meaningful again? And I also would add to that one, is there any chance of restoring civility and true bipartisanship? All right, who goes first? Sheila.
I want to just build on the last question dealing with Syria and Afghanistan. And I would only say that Congress has to be the adult in the room and emphasize to the American people, and I've been on the side of opposing the Iraq War extensively and questioned Syria, but I do believe it is a responsibility of Congress for checks and balances, and precipitous withdrawals that impact our allies is not an adult way to perform. And I think members who are here who may have differing views do want to make the point that we are engaging with our allies in a mutually respectful manner. and that we believe it is important to engage them when we make major decisions such as Syria and Afghanistan. That's number one. On the issue of what can we do, I would only offer to say to you that we have legislative tools. We have the ability to hold someone in contempt. We have ability to assess whether the executive has abused power. We have our voices. We have the American people's voices. We are the broad-based representatives. We go home to our district. So it really is using, in essence, the Congress's bully pulpit to explain to the American people that the action was wrong. I think of section, because I'm a lawyer, and I think of sections and articles in the Constitution, but Article 5, dealing with NATO, many of us are here to just reinforce our commitment to the transatlantic connection and relationship, and certainly NATO, that has proven well since the time that we've organized, and it has proven well for issues of Europe and issues in the United States. And I think we would do poorly if we precipitously went out of the NATO and Section 5 in particular, Article 5, excuse me, in particular. The Paris Climate Agreement was wrong. Getting out of the Iran agreement was wrong from my perspective. But in the instance of NATO, I think there would be strong backlash to speak out against any action like that, again, with not coordinating or speaking to our allies that are completely dependent, interdependent on this relationship. So you would hear a large outcry from the Congress, and I believe the American people, because I believe they understand it very well. I finished, John Dingell was a dear friend. He was a giant of a man in more ways than one. And his words will be particularly important, probative, and instructive. It's kind of like he's saying, get money out of politics. I'd love to do that. We're all working to do that. But I think one of the most important points, as he's saying, is we should not be bought and paid for, and that we must act from a moral conscience and a moral compass. And I can assure you there are many members of Congress, why don't I say all, no matter what party they're in, that I hope and that they hope and they believe are working from a high moral compass and a moral conscience.
Thank you. Mike.
On the issue of approval or disapproval of the president's actions, but Congress does much more than just be a commentary on the foreign policy of the administration. And it is evidenced by the fact that there are 55 of us that are here, and we're not just here making a statement in and out of the rooms of all these bilaterals. I assure you that a bunch of work is getting done that is actually within our portfolio. We legislate and appropriate in areas that affect not only our foreign policy, but many of the countries that are here, and Congress is fully engaged. With respect to NATO, I'm going to give you guys a little exercise. You should Google President Trump statements on NATO. Print out every article that you see, get out a red pen, and underline only those articles that are actually words that come out of his mouth. You will find that there are many articles that are interpretation or analysis of what Trump's temperament might be or what his prior statements in private to others might be. But if you actually look at his statements, and specifically the one that he just signed at the last NATO summit, you're going to see a full support for NATO, and I believe that that's what you have from the administration, or I wouldn't be serving in, just on the Armed Services Committee advocating for it, but also I serve in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and have been its past president, and I think I can honestly say to all the people that are there, you have the full support of the United States, and I don't mean just Congress. With respect to John Dingell, I don't think Congress is broken. I think cable news is broken, because I can tell you this, you watch cable news, and that's not the institution I work in. But there's a book, it's written on the history of the House, and I know I'm going to mispronounce it, but it was the House historian who wrote it. Is it Ramini? Do you know does someone know the name? If you Google this book and you read it, it tells the history of the House. We're actually doing pretty good from a historical perspective, because it's been even much more of a mess than this. But I do think we can always do better, and that's kind of like the American idea, right? We're always striving to perfect the idea and do better. And I think John Dingell's words call us to do better, but I don't think we're broken.
Who's next? Chris.
The American people have a long history of trying to avoid inevitable action, and then when we've tried and tried and tried, stepping up and doing difficult, brave, and historic things. I think we have a moment where Congress is going to have to demonstrate more cohesive, more forward-leaning action in terms of reassuring our alliances and putting some boundaries around presidential action with regards to the Korean Peninsula, our partnership in NATO, and our ongoing role in Syria and Afghanistan. There are folks, both ends of our political spectrum, who do want to see us withdraw from the world, but they are not the majority. And they're certainly not the majority of Congress, and they don't represent the best interests in the long term of the American people. So we have some hard work to do. And being here is in and of itself reinforcing some of that bipartisanship. I've had some wonderful conversations this weekend, forgive me, but on the sides of this, traveling over and traveling back, I'm having some great conversations with brand new members of the Senate and the House. Nothing helps us have a clearer vision of America's role in the world than being at a conference where there are speakers representing China, Russia, other countries, and where we were represented, and having a sense of how we seem to the rest of the world, and being challenged to focus on what it is that has been admirable and positive about the United States over the last 7 decades, not that which has at times been puzzling or frustrating or confounding about the United States. About bipartisanship, I don't know what state my colleagues represent, but when I go home to Delaware, everybody says to me, why don't you work across the aisle? Why can't you all get along? Why can't you solve problems? When the government of the United States is largely shut down for 35 days, and we've got folks out there, FBI, ATF, DEA, working without pay, everybody in my state says we should be embarrassed and we ought to get this fixed and we ought to get over it. We've made it through civil war. We've made it through a depression. We've made it through 2 great world wars. The United States has risen to the occasion in the past. I am confident that we will survive and transcend our current political challenges and difficulties. I do think cable news and the way we raise money and the way we connect with each other in a digital age are real challenges. But I'm confident that the American people will meet our commitments, and that our commitments to the allies who have stood shoulder to shoulder with us and sacrificed and served in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and elsewhere are deserving of and will still earn and win our affection and support. Thank you.
Alyssa.
So I don't want to repeat, and I agree with much of what my colleague said. I think, you know, in the United States, we give broad authority to the executive branch to dictate foreign policy. That is, and we're learning just how much, you know, was sort of taken for granted as a balance of powers now, as the president really exercises his authority. And there are some limits to what we can do through legislation and appropriation. I think it's interesting to think about sort of updating some of the ways we think about our engagement in the world and taking all the good energy that's come out of, you know, a bipartisan agreement on supporting allies and kind of update our thinking in legislation, right? Since 9/11, the United States has not fought in a war without allies. We cannot do it. If you're going to counter global threats, you need a global coalition. And so in that way, any one president is simply a steward of our coalition and allied relationships and taking care of those relationships for the next generation. Because if we don't have you all to fight with us, to provide intelligence, to provide support, then we are strategically putting ourselves at risk because the threats are global. And I think it's interesting to think about what we can do in legislation that reinforces that idea that you can't break relationships with allies because they are strategically important to the long term of the United States. On NATO, I mean, I think there's strong support for NATO. You would definitely hear an outcry. I would say that for my Washington colleagues who are in the room, the foreign policy establishment must do better in explaining why our institutions and our liberal global order is important to people who aren't in this business. We talk to ourselves very, very well. We're great at it. But how do we communicate to my dad, who's in the meat business, why NATO is important? How are you going to connect that to his pocketbook or his kids or his grandkids? And if you can't explain to my dad why NATO's not important, you're probably not talking to the vast majority of people who are going to be your allies if we have something like a pullout of NATO. So this is my charge to everyone, to please communicate out.
So it's bedtime for everybody but Wolfgang. And to you, my dear friend, you were right. I had no sense that all these people would show up to hear from highly intelligent, motivated members of Congress. And the one other thing I'd like to say is, aside from thanking colleagues I've worked with over the years, is, Alyssa, if we're electing people like you, the future will be bright. Thank you all.